Welcome everyone to Luminoso's Voice of the Employee and Resurgence of Unionization webinar. My name is Kim Larson. I'm a Senior Client Success Manager here at Luminoso, and I'm accompanied with our co-hosts. We have Garret Robinson and Satoshi Asari. Garret, would you like to introduce yourself first?
Yeah, thank you. As Kim mentioned, my name is Garret Robinson. I have a master's in industrial and organizational psychology, and I am an organizational development specialist.
Great, glad to have you. And Satoshi?
Thanks, Kim. I'm Satoshi Asari. I'm responsible for product and customer experience here at Luminoso. I'll be mostly in the background during the webinar, but I'll be back at the end with some commonly asked questions.
Awesome. We look forward to those questions. But in the meantime, let's get started. Starting with the being aware of unions and knowing that they're a long part of many worker histories. We have textiles, farm workers, miners, etc. The classic blue-collar unions, many of us are familiar with. And unions have been making a comeback. We've noticed they're coming up in additional industries. So, nursing, education kind of stepped in after that blue-collar time. And now we're seeing it more in the tech and service industries. And we think this is something worth looking into. So we want to look into why are unions happening and what's causing it to happen now. So I'll flip that question over to Garret. Garret, why are we seeing the unionization movement now?
Yeah, so the unionization movement is a really complicated topic. But the way I see it, there are three big reasons why we're seeing an uptick in unionization uptake and new memberships growing. And first being the pandemic, right? So global lockdowns really put a lot of stress on a lot of different economies and a lot of different industries. And not every company or organization adapted as well as others during these struggles. So some employees really found themselves in a losing situation and found that they weren't being taken care of. Secondly, unions aren't new. Unions have been around, as you mentioned, for a long time, especially in the history of the United States, to provide voice for employees. All employees want to be heard, want to make sure that their voices matter, and that if they have problems in the workplace, that they're being addressed and not being ignored. We're also seeing that related to the issue of the pandemic, we're seeing a greater surge in unionization for customer-facing industries. So a lot of people were able to work remotely during pandemic and keep themselves, employed, have a little bit more greater, work-life balance. And not everyone had that flexibility, unfortunately, especially those that were in customer-facing positions where your role kind of requires that you're right up front with the public. And again, those people were put under a greater stress than others, right? And again, not everyone was being taken care of or allowed to be safe during those times. And thirdly, I'd say that social media has really allowed unions to grow and provided a space for people to talk about unions and their grievances in the workplace. I'll use the example of TikTok, especially because that's kind of seems where it kind of leans in that direction. It seems like it's a pretty popular space right now for unions, especially where you indicate to the algorithm in the background that you're interested in a certain kind of topic, right? Someone has a post about, their local union movement or something that happened in their local union. You indicate that you're interested in that information. You start getting sent more and more, and eventually you might even bump into someone in your own region or maybe even your own company that is working with unions. And so it provides not just a new platform for people to get together, but one that really curates and gathers information together that you might be interested in. And so it kind of grows it itself.
Yeah. So the pandemic introduced unprecedented times. It was hard for companies to be strategic because for a lot of these big corporations, you have a 5-year, 10-year, 20-year plan, and then you have to change in the course of days, weeks, months, years. Like it really did a shift because the conditions change, the needs change. If you're in a service-facing industry, PPE is probably not necessarily something that you'd considered until the pandemic started. And yeah, algorithms, if you have, I think TikTok's maybe more known for the jokes and the humor and the frustrations of day-to-day life. And then, you're down the barista chain or the driver chain, et cetera. That can result in echo chambers in a whole bunch of ways, independent of geography. And then you're right, seeing it in more local level sometimes too. So that's why people are drawn to unions. But what do unions do at their core that make that the viable option that people think it is and find it to be?
Yeah, so at their core, unions are meant to provide a collective voice for employees and to bridge a communication gap that has, formed between employees and those in power in the organization, right? So with this collective voice, employees are more likely to have control over what happens to them in the workplace, right? They can come together and make demands, ask for changes to be made, right? They're also able to provide a certain degree of safety and to employees and help reduce uncertainty so that after these grievances have been aired and you've asked for changes to be made, you're less likely to have blowback and retaliation because you're working together as a whole group. It's not just in one individual that's easy to cut out, right? And as I mentioned, unions really form in the absence of good leadership, really, when there is a void where normal communication should happen between employees and leadership.
Yeah, kind of building a bridge. So if employees are struggling with like poor direct managers, there's that gap in communication in between. What can executives and like high level leadership or maybe invested leadership do in bridging that gap and connecting with the employees that are having those frustrations and challenges in their day-to-day work lives?
Yeah, so if there isn't an official channel for that communication to happen, if there aren't already ways that leadership is trying to figure out what's going on with the employees, what is the employee experience, then it can be really difficult to see these things coming and to, try to actually be agile, right? However, if there are employee issues, if employees are frustrated and starting to disengage from work, even if you're not asking those questions directly, you're going to start seeing signs. And those things will come about as higher churn. People are going to leave the organization if they're not happy, and if other options are going to start looking more attractive. You're going to have productivity declines, most likely, from those that do stay, and from the indirect effect of people leaving, you're going to have fewer people to work. And even if you're not asking direct questions about how things are going, you will probably start to hear these echoes of frustration anyways, even if it's a more informal, casual manner, right? So theoretically, you're speaking with your direct reports as a leader of the company. They're speaking to their direct reports and so on. So up the chain, you will start to hear maybe common issues. Maybe you've heard about staff meetings that get derailed, where instead of talking about what actually needs to happen, it turns into a place for people to complain and to be upset because there isn't any other place to do it, right? So you can find those signs if you're paying attention, even if although I still would suggest a more proper channel for that communication.
Yeah, so let's look at that summary since we have that slide prepared. You indicated churn and turnover, and that is also sort of the inability to backfill. When you're interviewing new employees, they're trying to shop around for the next place they want to work at. They're going to get some signals like, there's something wrong with this engine here. So just the reduction of employee count, and reduced employee productivity for maybe previously high performers or even average employers. You see those like traces of burnout. And echoes of frustration and conflict. Like you're going to hear about it. You're going to see the lack of volunteering for new projects. You're going to feel the lack of innovation. That is quite a bit. So let's say a company is seeing some or all of these things, hopefully not many, but enough to be like, I want to move the needle. I want to take things to the next level. What are things that some leaders can be doing to start addressing these issues before it becomes worst case scenario?
Yeah, so if you think there might be an issue with your employees and you don't already have robust communication channels set up to be able to find out that information directly, the first step is to start asking questions, right? So as I mentioned before, unions are really an informal organization that comes about when things aren't going well in the workplace and when employees aren't being heard. So you can get ahead of that and you can kind of create a win-win situation where you just listen to your employees and start asking good questions before employees ever think we need to come up with our own solution, right? So provide an avenue for those those questions to be heard and for communication to happen between leadership and employees. And through that communication and those questions you're asking, you can actually start to see benefits other than just, avoiding frustration and not having to deal with unions if that is your objective. When employees feel heard and the problems they face are being solved, you're more likely to keep them around. As I mentioned before, other companies aren't going to look as attractive if they're just fine where they're at. Moving to a new company is a lot of work, and it has to be worth that time and effort. So if they're getting what they need right now, they're not going to go through that effort. Employees that are being heard and feel seen by the company and appreciated are going to work with probably higher engagement, right? They're going to be more interested in what's going on at the company. They're going to be more invested in the company's success. And so you're going to draw a sharper line between what I'm doing today in my work is going to benefit me because it's going to keep the company that's taking care of me around, right? And finally, it really will improve the organization's reputation, not just with their own employees and those that the employees might be recommending, their friends and family come apply to this new job that just showed up, right? But also with customers, because I won't get into specific examples, but I'm sure we've all seen instances where companies that treat their employees poorly start to suffer on the customer side because people, all else being equal, if they have options, are not going to spend their money on companies and organizations that they feel like don't reflect their values. And for a lot of buyers, treating your employees well is a core value, right?
Absolutely.
So yeah, you can see plenty of benefits to listening to your employees in addition to just avoiding other issues, right?
Yeah. Two sides of the same coin. One has consequences, one has pretty nice incentives, I think. So if we could take a look at those, for folks who are taking screenshots, benefits 1, 2, 3, loyalty to the company, both in retaining employees and attracting stronger talent, attachment to the role, and loyalty to brand. I know I've shopped around and kind of looked around like, yeah, what brands reflect my ethics? So that's always been helpful. So we understand that not listening has consequences. Listening and acting on that has benefits. So how do we go about collecting that feedback? How do I go about starting to build that bridge and bridging that gap?
I kind of hinted at it before, but really the first thing is to start asking questions, right?
Yes. And I'll say go on, but kind of a planted question, but a lot of companies and leaders are maybe stuck in, understandably, reaction mode with the pandemic. If you're experiencing a lack of employees, if you're experiencing a lack of volunteerism, if you're not getting maximum, it is really easy to be in reactive mode. And it can be hard to think like, okay, I need to not just stop the bleeding, but like address the core issue that's causing the challenge in the first place. What are good ways to ask?
That's a great question. So one thing I think that's helpful for people to remember is you can treat the communication between an organization and its employees as a relationship, just like any relationship. You have to ask questions. You have to check in and see what's going on with anyone you have, working relationship, friendly, family, romantic, it doesn't matter. You have to ask questions and you have to check in, right? So keeping that in mind, that should help guide you a little bit, but some more specific advice would be first, ask at scale, right? So in an ideal world, as a leader, you would be able to sit down with any of your employees and ask them directly what's going on, right? Treat it like a real personal relationship. However, when you are a leader of an organization over hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, so on, you can't do that, unfortunately. It just isn't possible with the amount of people there are and the amount of time that you have as an individual, even as a team of leaders, right? So you have to find a way to ask at scale, right? And you make sure that you're getting feedback from everyone in the organization, not just picking and choosing those individuals that you do have contact with, because you want to get a broad scope of what's going on in the organization, and you don't want any of your findings influenced by, this one-on-one relationship. You don't want to be cherry picking and just look for the answers you want to hear, because that's not going to help you succeed as an organization. And in the vein of asking at scale, right, you need to find some sort of tool, right? Is really what I'm getting at. You need to find some way, whether it's surveys, whether it's, you can use text analysis, as a great example, or maybe a relevant example. But you need to find some way of getting feedback from everyone that works for you as an organization, both in terms of cost and, time that's available. Secondly, you need to make sure that with however you are trying to communicate with your employees, you're working on building trust. If employees don't trust that the process is safe and authentic, you're not going to get good information. No one's going to be honest, right? And they're not going to be forthcoming with what's going on in the workplace, because they're either going to be afraid that criticisms and critiques are going to see retaliation, or they're just going to find it a waste of their time, right? We've all been there. We've all seen surveys, right, where you feel like, okay, this is just going to go and filed into a cabinet somewhere. I'm going to give quick responses so I can check this off my to-do list and get my manager off my back. In contrast, if an employee feels like someone is actually going to sit down with that information that that you're writing down and actually take it to thought, they're more likely to give well thought out, interesting responses. And they might tell you things that you didn't already know about the organization that you're running, right? And really the tricky thing is with building trust is that there is no immediate strategy that's going to get you results, or get you immediate results, I should say. It has to be something that's built up over time. And the only way to build trust is to continue to communicate with your employees respectfully and honestly, right? And that just has to happen over time. The first time you hold a survey, you may not expect very good results, especially if this is brand new to the organization. If you're not a company that's built on surveys and this kind of communication style, it's going to be rough at first. That's just something you need to know ahead of time. But as you continue doing it, as you continue communicating with employees and letting them know what you see, right? That's one big piece, is when you gather survey information, let them know what you're hearing to make sure that you're hearing it correctly, right? As you continue this over time, your response rates will improve. The responses you get are going to be more in depth and more honest, right? And then hopefully over time, you should be able to start being able to actually have really good usable data. And finally, I would say, give space for stories, right? When you're building surveys, it's great to have questions that are really specific with, predefined responses, right? Or like with scoring, for example, right? Like, can you rate your satisfaction right now with these areas, area 1, 2, and 3? However, it's also a great idea to include questions that are a bit more open-ended, so that way your employees can kind of tell a story about their experience, because try as you might, you are probably not going to be able to build a perfect survey, right? Especially not the first time. And so what you want to do is you want to allow employees the room to tell you things they think you should know that you didn't even think to ask about, right? And that kind of goes back to having a good tool, because if you're asking stories, you're probably talking about long response questions, right? People are going to want to start writing essays depending on who they are, and you have to go through that information. And so using a text analysis tool like Luminoso, in my own personal experience, is a great example.
Thanks. Yeah, we see that a lot. Like if you're designing a survey in like at the headquarters office, for example, and you're in this kind of echo chamber, speaking of algorithms, this natural echo chamber of people who have this opinion of, oh, it's great to come to the office, but you're maybe disconnected from the remote employees who have different goals and objectives. They're going to have a different story to tell than someone who's like in a manufacturing plant or in the, whatever the front lines is for the company. And that ability to ask questions, that ties into what we see with the voice of the customer as well. Anyone who's designing surveys to understand a different audience, there's innately going to be a detachment from what the survey designer experiences and what that audience is wanting to communicate. One of the examples that we see is, why did you quit? Whether it's the game or the company, because I was losing, because I found a better job. That shortcut answer it's a really easy question to ask. It's like, well, I asked and they said there's nothing I could do. Versus going for that story and how you make a prompt around it. Well, why did you start or try this? What were your initial expectations? What are you doing instead? And kind of wedging that all into a single prompt for people to really bridge those gaps on their own. Like, I really liked the goal of the company. And then I found out that day-to-day did not include that. And you can start to kind of bridge those maybe more systematically.
Yeah. And asking stories can also help you build better surveys down the road, right? If you start seeing really frequent responses in your open-ended questions, let's say the issue of, I don't know, team meeting frequency comes up a lot in these open-ended questions. And that's not something that you had in your more focused questions. That's a great place to improve your survey for the next round. Include an actual question that says, how happy are you with the frequency of the team meetings? Should they happen more often, less often, and so forth, right? So there really isn't a reason not to include at least some open-ended questions. Get those stories, let the employees help you learn how to communicate, basically.
Yeah, and recognizing that can be tough for a lot of organizations because they're really attached to their KPIs of, I track this score, I track this mention for the last 20 years. Having space for some agility to be responsive, recognize that times do change. The question that was really relevant 20 years ago, was it really an evergreen question?
Right.
So that was great. Thank you, Garret. So let's take a slight pivot over to the questions because I suspect we have a few of those queued up. Satoshi, will you share some of the common questions that we see and start to tackle those? Or no, good point. Key takeaways. I can summarize those first. So unions are a way for employees to be heard. It bridges the communication gap. Employees have to trust the process, that it will be responded to in order for them to bring forward their stories. Like, I'm not going to say something that's going to get me fired is a lot of people's approaches. And if they don't know where that line is, they're going to keep that feedback to themselves. And people talk to each other. If you're not asking the contractor who's here for 6 months, they're still going out to lunch with the employee who's been here for 10 years. So making sure you collect all of the feedback to know what the overall culture is, not just the echo chamber of who we perceive as value or not. And there's benefits to that: retention, morale, attracting talent, attracting innovation. All these customers will start to care and be invested in that when they have the option to shop around. And trust is essential for any program. People don't want to waste their time doing something that's just a check mark for someone else. So great. Thank you, Garret. Great summary.
Of course.
Now, Satoshi, hit us with those questions.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Garret and Kim. That was really interesting discussion. So let's start with the questions. So something we hear often, as we talk to, prospective people we can work with here is, I personally believe, in this use case, and I identify, for example, with a lot of the things that you may have said just now, but how do I convince my executive team to, institute these programs and act on the feedback that we're collecting?
That's a great question. Yeah. So a lot of the content you're hearing here, we may be preaching to the choir a little bit. If you are already in the HR space, the employee experience space. However, you may have to bring these points up to higher leadership who this just isn't where they live, right? This isn't the stuff they talk about every day. They have 1,000 things on their mind and to worry about. So how do you reach them and convince them this is a priority? Tie it to money. It would be my #1 recommendation. And what's really nice is that you don't have to make anything out to tie this to money, right? These are the things we're talking about: higher productivity, lower turnover, reputation with customers and potential new employees. Those are things that have real connections to bottom line. And so it's not really that hard to make a leap from what we're talking about to a return of investment. You just have to make sure that to make that leap for your leaders, right? Make sure that there's no guesswork involved, to really make sure it's clear you will save money doing this or make more money doing this, right? And that would be my number one recommendation.
Yeah, and I'll jump in with a tactical example. Onboarding may take 3 months, 6 months, a year, depending on the industry. Mm-hmm. Onboarding is money. And depending on what your bandwidth is for training those onboarding employees, the cost just went up. It's not just for the onboardee, but it's for the trainers and the onboardee every iteration.
Yeah.
And that can be brutal.
Absolutely. It is hard to quantify just how expensive training is, because not only are you having to pay for a new person to go through the training courses, which you may be paying for licenses, you might be paying for trainers to come in from outside the organization, but you're also losing experience you had already built up, right? And that experience could have been handed off to new employees as people start doing mentoring and shadowing, right? And it adds up incredibly quickly.
Yeah. So one seat example, tied to money, there's one way how.
Interesting. Great advice there. So another question. So let's say I do this and I ask these open-ended questions like you're suggesting. And it turns out our employees are giving feedback about very specific topics, maybe that one that I didn't anticipate necessarily. So for example, these days, maybe something about vaccine mandates or something like that. How would I go about exploring sort of a specific topic like that within the scope of things?
Pick me, because there's a lot of different approaches, right? And it gets harder the more agile your survey is. I think people can recognize that. Like, if you're asking a completely new question every time and you have hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands more employees, it can be really hard to ask a new question every iteration about like, oh, do I have to go to work? Do I have to wear a mask in the office? Do I have to have a vaccine? Like, what are all the things that I can have opinions on? It's going to vary depending on your technology. If you have no technology base, it's reading a lot of things manually. And hope that you have a lot of resources. Although if you're at this webinar and you've made it this far, I'm going to go with that's not the assumption. Our clients have benefited from being able to do concept deep dives, where the workflow is, if they mentioned concept X, let's branch it and see everything they had to say when they mentioned that thing. So if they mentioned WebEx or Zoom or vaccine mandates or whatever the current topic of the day is, we can branch that. We can see who's saying what and what kind of impact that has. Because sometimes we'll see something as a low driver, like they're associated with low scores, but we check concept level sentiment and we see like, I dislike X, I hate Y, I'm only here because of this. And you're finding that it's scooping up otherwise really dissatisfied employees or customers or whoever. And it's like that one saving grace. And you can also cross compare of like, there's some things that are just annoying, like long receipts or, a certain thing, like it's not really impacting satisfaction, but maybe has a negative sentiment. We want to cross check those. And yeah, track it over time. Sometimes what was really popular 2 years ago, where maybe I feel super comfortable if I'm wearing a mask, now that time has passed, been boosted enough times, I now feel better about masks, and masks mean something differently than it did before. So it depends on your technology. We've gotten lucky with our clients and being able to use ours, but it's going to vary from solution to solution.
All right, interesting. Thanks, Kim. All right, next question. So what about you know, I mean, we talked a little bit about data. You know, Garret, you talked a little bit about how one might go about designing a survey, asking the right questions, and you know, creating room for stories and stuff like that. But what about other data? There's lots of data out there, you know, on the web, public data, you know, and things like that. So, you know, should we be just looking at surveys, or are there other data sources that we could be leveraging?
Sounds like a very planted question, but I like it. Because it goes back to the core point from the webinar, right? Like there's a lot of ways people are communicating. They're not necessarily the orthodox ways anymore. People may have historically trusted employees to say something to their manager, but with employee churn and changing, maybe that's not the culture anymore. We missed the pulse on that's not a reliable source of feedback anymore. So gathering as many sources of communication methods to process and seeing what's unique to Glassdoor versus coming through our employee surveys. Because one's our reputation out in the public marketplace. Maybe people trust Glassdoor more than they trust the company surveys. Maybe outsourcing that research to an outside firm who ensures the anonymity, comparing that to other surveys or Glassdoor. Any source of communication that you have, Luminoso and Daylight is domain agnostic. You can pipe it all into the same project and see what is unique to one subset versus another, so that you really understand, you know, am I getting the full picture? But also making sure that trust is paramount, because if people get the sense that their communications on one platform are being monitored more than they're comfortable with, they're going to change platforms, and you lose that really critical pulse on what's going on. So yes, pull everything, also maintain ethics. People are creative, evolution goes in one way or another based on the environment. So things to keep in mind. Any other feedback on that question, or do we want to go to the next question?
No, I think you covered that. Yeah, I have nothing else to add for that one.
Cool. All right.
All right, I think we're down to the last question. So I think, you know, this has all been great. And, you know, I think there's a lot of, you know, benefit that we can get out of, you know, doing some of the things that were discussed here, right? And certainly, Kim, you mentioned technology, of course. But, you know, Garret, you made mention of, you know, tools and technologies as well. You know, and it certainly doesn't seem feasible to, you know, do the kinds of things you were talking about manually, right? So, but I'm not a tech person. Like I'm not confident that I can use these technologies. It sounds complicated. You know, so what do you say to people that ask, you know, that are sort of in those shoes?
I mean, that's awesome. That's a great question. Yeah, because it can be daunting when you're talking about things like AI and analysis and data, right? So I will say from personal experience, being on a team that used Daylight specifically, you know, on a daily basis, that we had people on every end of that spectrum, right? People who in previous roles and in their current role work with data every day. It was, they love numbers, analysis is totally familiar to them. And we had people who come from different backgrounds, right? They're not using data the same way. They're not looking at, you know, analysis tools in the past or frequently, right? So I will say that everyone on my team had a really easy time adapting to Daylight. You know, no matter what background is, you have to learn how to use new tools. And I would say that the learning curve for everyone was pretty similar. Even if this is your first time looking at analysis tool, it was set up pretty intuitively and with a little bit of guidance from either, you know, our product manager or account manager, we were able to solve pretty much any problem pretty quickly.
Cool. Well, I appreciate that. And I also want to thank everyone for attending. If you'd like to connect with any of us about Voice the Employee or text analytics or employee engagement in general, we're all available for that. And you can access our LinkedIn contact information or a follow-up email as needed. So thank you, everyone. We look forward to having you at our next webinar. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.